There it goes. Wow, Sonny is a clever person I am. So anyway, Herzl, as I told you, was covering the case, and he was so upset by what he saw and the behavior of the crowds and so on that he created this Zionist movement in about 5 years' time and proceeded to die himself in approximately 7. So he was so obsessed and worked himself to such a degree as a result of that. So these are things that you really want to be able to read, and that's what that source is. So I do recommend that. Okay, so we were talking about Jewish history. We will get to now that we have some books. We will get to Mendelssohn when we get to him. Okay.
No.
Huh? Okay, now, what's your question? Oh, okay. So we answered. All right, any questions? Where are we standing? Oh, that's a bit how to discover problem, only because of the books. But I put out some more books next time. Probably 2 or 3 of the Rudovsky book and probably 2 of the history. So those people who feel that they still want a book, I will have them. I apologize, but the mails are a little bit slow. So we were talking about Jewish history and how we got to the situation that we're going to study in this class. Rudovsky also writes about that in his first several chapters, what he calls tortured drifting and the medical situation of the Jewish people. So we should look at that because we don't want to get an emancipation situation before we know what they're being emancipated from. So the Jerusalem book is the classic text of emancipation. It was written by Moses Mendelssohn, and I do think Felix Mendelssohn is his grandson. It may be his son, but I do think it's his grandson. Felix Mendelssohn basically was a traitor to his grandfather. He converted to Christianity and so on and so forth. Wrote, different things about, Christian inspirational music and so on. And all of Mendelssohn's grandchildren ultimately converted to Christianity. And it's not a very nice comment for Mendelssohn, who was determined not to have that happen. But that's how strong the pressures were. Of course, Felix Mendelssohn didn't get any gratitude from the Third Reich for that, because I think Hitler was obsessed with eradicating his memory and with making sure his music never got played in that period anyway. And for Hitler, Felix Mendelssohn was a Jew, that's all. And it didn't matter that he said he was a Christian. That didn't make any difference to him or the people around him. As I said, Herzl's family was similarly tragic. These are all really tragic stories. I'm sorry to give you so many tragic stories. I don't know any really nice stories. I think one of the most tragic is Zola himself. You've heard of Emile Zola, the French novelist and so on. And he's the one who did go to Dreyfus's defense and did write the expose of the military political establishment for basically trying to pick the weakest person and blame him for whatever they thought was going on at that time in terms of espionage. When he ran away to England because he was in such a dire situation, I think actually Dreyfus was shot at one point. Anyway, he ran away to England because of the dire situation. And after quite a while, he came back. I don't know, somewhere in the early 1900s, maybe 1907 or thereabouts. I'm not sure exactly what date he came back. But someone climbed up on the roof of his apartment building and put a block on his chimney one night and asphyxiated both his wife and himself. That was Zola's fate for having come to the defense of what he thought was honor. So he was killed, and his wife was killed, and so on and so forth. So this is the kind of thing that did go on up until, well, of course, we know the Holocaust. So there's a huge tragedy waiting in the wings to happen. So it isn't just these people. So let's go back then and see how we got into the situation. I don't want to be, say, oh, it's Christianity's fault, it's Christianity's fault, it's a Christianity's fault. That is part of the problem. But it isn't just that which is the fault. It's how Christianity became the way it became, which is the problem. I mean, Christianity is supposed to be a Jewish messianic movement. How it turned into something that was antagonistic to both Judaism and the Jewish people, even though you who are Christian, and most of you in this class are Christian, I think, don't feel that antagonism, or you probably wouldn't be here unless you're doing what Hitler did, trying to study the enemy. Hitler went to Zionist lectures in Vienna, trying to figure out how he was going to deal with these people. Apparently, it was very effective what he learned in these lectures, because he then turned it to the use that he turned it to. But I know that you people don't suffer from those kind of complexes, or you wouldn't be here. But how did that come to be? Well, we took our situation down to the Maccabean uprising, as I recall, and we scooted through that pretty quickly. But first of all, we had the first exile, right, which was around 600, really 585 on precise dates. 585 to about 540, but it really kept on going till about 450 or so, because the first returnees didn't flourish, and then the second returnees started to flourish, and that's the books of Nehemiah, Ezra that you close the Bible with, the Old Testament. So the Bible really leaves off there, and we enter a dark period. We go into a dark tunnel. Who knows? I know something of it, but do you know what happened between 450 and, let's say, 175? No, there's nothing in the Apocrypha about that. Do you know what happened? Almost nobody knows at all what happened. It was just like a period of dark. Why is it dark? Because the Bible closes with the last books, Chronicles, Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah, and so on, in the 400s. Now, the Maccabee books are in the Christian Bible, but not in the Jewish Bible, which is an anomaly. Why aren't the Maccabee books, I told you a little bit last time, in the Jewish Bible? Huh?
Civil War.
Well, the people who compiled the Bible as we now have it were whom?
Christians.
No. No. What about the Jewish Bible? The Pharisees. Bush lied. People died. Really? Is that the whole reason for the war in Iraq? I hope not. I thought Saddam was a pretty nasty fellow, as I recall, but anyway. The Pharisees were the party. When did they compile the Old Testament as we know it? Well, they didn't compile the Old Testament as we know it until after the war against Rome, because they were afraid the books were going to be scattered and so on and so forth, or lost, and etc. And they had some grudges to settle with different party strife, who would get in and who would get out. So the Bible, as we know it on the Jewish side, not on the Christian side, we'll get to in a minute, was not compiled until 100 AD or so. When was the war against Rome? These are dates you should be, just burned into your memory. Because you can't do, you say, well, I'm doing modern. Yeah, you're doing modern, but how did the Jews get to the situation they're in?
Don't they say they made the Septuagint like 200 though?
Wait. Answer the first question. Answer the first question I asked. When was the war against Rome? We'll get to the Septuagint. We haven't gotten the Septuagint yet.
66 to 70.
Yeah, you got it. 66 to 70, right? So somewhere after that, around 100, we don't have it really clear. But when was the second war against Rome? 132 to 136. And that really stamped out everything, right? We covered that last time. Okay, so the Jewish collection we know as the, I don't know what you want to call it. The Jews call it the Tanakh. How can one explain that to someone who doesn't know Hebrew? I don't know. I mean, who knows what Tanakh means? Go ahead.
Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim.
That's right. So what is it then? It's an acronym. Well, I got that wrong anyway. It should be probably an I. Okay. So what do they mean, those three things?
Torah means teaching.
Yeah, I think it's, maybe, yeah, I guess so. It's kind of teaching. It's the law. It's the first 5 books of Moses and so on. So what's Nevi'im? You obviously know these things from your education. The prophets and Ketuvim, writings. And they go in descending order of holiness. The rabbis talk about, does a certain book impede your holiness of your hands if you touch it or so on. You have to be in a state of ritual cleanliness when you look at these things. So on and so forth. So the Torah is the most holy. Prophets are second most holy. Ketuvim, the rabbis say, well, they don't disturb your holiness at all. They're kind of neutral. What would they throw in under Ketuvim? Well, things like Ecclesiastes, wisdom, Proverbs, the writings. It's weird the way they do it because for them, where do you put Joshua? He goes into prophets, even though he's not, or Samuel goes into prophets. Where do you put Psalms? It probably goes in writings, you see. In any case, the big problem with those things, and this gentleman here is talking about the Septuagint, is Daniel. I mentioned him last time. Where do you put Daniel? The Jews put Daniel under what? Writings, as I told you last time. And the Christians put Daniel under prophets. Because Daniel is a new kind of thing. It's what we call in the field and the language apocalyptic. It isn't exactly prophecy. Because it doesn't really have a symbolic language about weird imagery and vivid revelationary sort of presentation, like the apocalypse of the New Testament, which basically tries to imitate or continue its style. That's where you get the revelation of the New Testament book, because it's supposed to be, another, it's called the apocalypse. So it's a new style that we call, I don't know what they called it then, if they called it apocalypse then, but it's a new style. And the problem is the rabbis didn't like the book, because it was books like that that they blamed the war against Rome on, and they were against the war against Rome. The Pharisees did not participate in the war against Rome. Now you say, well, the Pharisees were smart. Yeah, well, maybe in retrospect they were smart. But at the time, the war was a popular war. And how do we know it? Just read Josephus. He documents it. He shows you it was supported by the large number of the population. So this idea that the Pharisees are the popular party is something that the Pharisee party has put upon the history because they're the ones who survived. And the people who survived, the victors, if you like, they weren't the victors, but they survived. That's a victory in itself. Write the history. Now for them, the paradigmatic moment is when the famous rabbi, you should know this, Yochanan ben Zakkai, has himself smuggled out of Jerusalem in a coffin. Now that really is symbolic. It's the only way you could get out as a dead man, in fact. He has himself smuggled out of Jerusalem in a coffin because he gets his nephews in the rabbinic literature. It's going to be in my new book that I'm writing that's coming out in October, the New Testament Code. Because he gets the Roman, according to the Talmudic sources, I don't know how reliable they are, he gets the Roman commander Vespasian, or his son Titus, according to the Talmud it's Vespasian, but we know that Vespasian had already gone back to Rome at this time, so it has to be his son Titus who's in command of the Roman troops besieging Jerusalem at that time. Anyway, the Talmud says he had an arrow shot into Vespasian's camp saying, Rabbi Yochanan is the emperor's friend. And then he's ushered before Vespasian. This is according to Talmudic account. I don't believe any of this. Something happened, but not maybe this exactly. Why do I don't believe this? Well, I don't believe the New Testament account of things either, but why don't I believe this? Because Josephus tells the same story about himself. Josephus says that. How many have read Josephus? He says that he was among the insurgent leaders in Galilee in 66 AD to 67, and he was in charge of the defense of Galilee, he claims. I always said it with friends like Josephus, you don't need enemies. In any case, he brags in his book about how he prepared the cities for the coming Roman army that they knew were coming. And as part of the Zealot Creed, you were not ever to surrender. It's sort of like the Muslim Hezbollah and these groups that are direct descendants of some of these Palestinian groups, actually. But you didn't surrender. That's why the people on Masada, how many have heard of Masada? They don't surrender. They commit mass suicide with their families. I'll explain that to you in a moment. But they don't surrender. It's a bit like Japanese. It's a bit like Hezbollah and so on. It's in the tradition of what we Jews were like that. Yeah, that's the way we were before they undermined us and made us into something, pathetic. They're very fierce, very resistance-minded people, and the war was popular. And I know that from reading the literature of the period, because they held out so long and they were so willing to sacrifice themselves. And all parties supported the war except the establishment parties that were indebted to the Romans. You have to understand the strife in this period. I do this in my historical Jesus class. I don't have time to do it too much in this class. But all, the Essenes supported the war, the Zealots supported the war, the people responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls clearly supported the war. That's why they didn't survive. And lots of other groups supported the war. I think the early Christians in Palestine, before they went overseas and became Polonized, the real messianic movement in Palestine, not the Romanized messianic movement that we presently are familiar with, that the Gospels have created. That's not the messianism in Palestine. The Dead Sea Scrolls are messianism in Palestine. It's just, if you want to read messianism, read the scrolls. Read the war scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Fortunately, they left us a time capsule from the past, sitting in caves, and now we know more than we ever knew about this period. So we know what the resistance-minded groups felt, thought, and were like. In any event, not to get too worked up about this, I do get worked up about it, but the Pharisees, represented by Yochanan, and Josephus says he was a Pharisee. Josephus said that after the Romans took all the cities that he supposedly supposed to have defended, and he didn't do a good job, he was stuck in the cave with about 10 other guys, and then he sort of winks when he tells this story. They all drew lots to see who would kill the other ones and then kill themselves. So Josephus says, and Josephus and a friend drew the short straws. So they killed all the others in the cave, and then they went in and surrendered to Vespasian. And that's how he survived. And that's how we got the literature, and that's how he's called Flavius, because when he surrendered to Vespasian, he was there at that time, this is before Vespasian went to Rome in 68 to take over the Roman Empire, he applied the Jewish messianic prophecy to Vespasian. He says it in his war, he says it in his autobiography. This is what the Talmudic people say Rabbi Yochanan did. Maybe they all did this, but the point was Vespasian must have gotten really pretty tired of all these Jewish turncoats and others, traitors and people, going and proclaiming him the world ruler that was going to come out of Palestine to rule the world. See, that's the messianic prophecy. That's what the Christians think Jesus was supposed to be, the world ruler that was to come out of Palestine to rule the world. And in their view, that's just what he has in a spiritual sense, in a spiritualized way, in an otherworldly sense. Certainly isn't running around doing it in a physical way. But the people who are waiting for the rapture and so on, they think he's going to come back or that they're going to join him, which is good. I mean, that's what they think. I'm glad that they feel that way, and that I hope for their sake it does happen. And we've been waiting 2,000 years, and in my view, that's the beauty of these ideas. The Muslims have the same thing. They're waiting, the Shiites and all the Hezbollah people. That's why I say it's all connected. All the Hezbollah people, they just haven't gotten into the modern world. They're waiting for the Mahdi to come. And they think that, if they do all these acts of terrorism and if they sacrifice themselves, they're going to join the Mahdi and the rapture and whatever it is that they're supposed to be getting into. And so it's, you see that all these ideas are similar in some regard, but usually they are the ideas of a resistance group. They are the ideas of a resistance group encouraging its members to fight to the end. And that's what was happening in Palestine. So the Pharisees didn't like this. And first of all, the Pharisees believed that you should, surrender temporal authority to the temporal powers. Paul is a Pharisee, he says. He grew up on the feet of Pharisees. It's a typical Pharisee position. Read Romans. How many have read Romans? 13. And you owe allegiance to the temporal authorities because the temporal authorities were placed in power by God, and therefore, who are you to question the results or God? I'm just paraphrasing this, and then he goes on to say the wearing of the sword will bring its own reward. Therefore, pay taxes. In other words, the whole issue in Palestine was not to pay taxes. Paul says pay taxes to the ruling authority who were placed there by God. And then he says, he quotes the love your neighbor as yourself in support of this, the all righteousness commandment, the thing that drove these resistance groups, the two love commandments. Loving your neighbor is the righteousness commandment, and loving God is the piety commandment. And you'll find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You'll find it in Josephus talking about John the Baptist. You'll see it as the essence, supposedly, of Jesus' teaching, and so on and so forth. You'll see it as that, as I said, of the Essenes, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Paul has the temerity to apply that to paying Roman taxes. He understands the symbolism of it. He's a smart guy. But, we aren't. You are not yet schooled in these things, so you can't understand without looking at this literature what he means by this, what he's up to. He's up to laughing at the people who won't pay their taxes because of the all righteousness commandment. The people who think that by loving God, there's only one ruler, God. And God rules here. Yisrael means Yisrael. El is God, Yisra is rules. This is the land God rules. The Roman emperor doesn't rule here. So you don't pay your taxes to Rome. And there's another passage in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is from Deuteronomy, you shall not put a foreigner over you. It's in the Torah of Moses. It's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's in the book of Deuteronomy. And I think that they took that very, very seriously. So you shouldn't you shouldn't recognize foreign rule as what the extremist groups thought. Now, the Pharisees were the temporizing groups. So anyway, Josephus applies the world ruler prophecy to Vespasian. I think the Talmud reflects that. So I don't think Rabbi Yochanan did that. But according to the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan did have an arrow shot into Vespasian's camp, did say he was a friend of the emperor, and when he was ushered into the emperor's presence, the emperor granted him something. The emperor to be. What did the emperor to be grant Rabbi Yochanan, who is supposedly the patriarch of Palestine after the fall of the temple? What did he grant Rabbi Yochanan? You can call him Yochanan if you want, or whatever. John, it's really John. What did he grant Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? An academy at a place called Yavne. Yavne, where's Yavne? It's near Tel Aviv. It's on the coast. It's not up in all the highland and troubled areas. It's on the coast. So, Rabbi Yochanan got an academy. It turned out that the patriarchs, Pharisee patriarchs, also became the Roman tax collectors in Palestine. That's what everyone forgets. Therefore, Paul is a perfect Pharisee. He does believe. He is the other side of the coin of Messianism. To my mind, basically, it's why I write the books I have, Paul is opposed to the Jerusalem presentation of the events surrounding Messianic occurrences in Palestine, whether it's Jesus that we can identify in any real way or others. There is a community that is the Messianic community, and I believe that they are the same as the Essenes, who we say the Dead Sea Scrolls are written by. But the Dead Sea Scroll literature doesn't look anything like any Essenes you ever saw, because the Dead Sea Scrolls literature is unremitting, very aggressive. It is not retiring. It is not apolitical. It is not otherworldly. It is very messianic. And it believes in a final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth. I know it's crazy. So do our Muslim friends who are doing all these things that we're watching today. But it's quite a beautiful idea. In fact, they get it directly from these people. It's a direct transmission through groups in Syria and Iraq, through Manichaeanism, through the Prophet Muhammad's encounter of these groups in southern Iraq when he was in the caravan trade, from the filtering of these groups down into northern Arabia in the 400s, 500s, and 600s to get out of the Roman grasp. And he encounters groups of this mindset clearly. Do you know that in southern Arabia there was a Jewish kingdom in the 400s and 500s? The Jews had taken over southern Arabia. Yemen, that's where we get all these Jews from Yemen. Yemen had a Jewish king called Dhu Nuwas. The Byzantines sent an army down from Ethiopia and destroyed him in the early 600s. And the Prophet's birth is dated by the appearance of the Ethiopian elephants at Mecca in the wake of this reconquest by the Christian authorities led by the Byzantines. So these ideas were percolating down there. I don't have any record of exactly what they were, but his teachers clearly were of a similar mindset of the kind that I'm telling you about. Now the Muslims, they didn't have any teachers. He was unlettered, an angel tutored him. Okay, that's theology and so on. But it's clearly has teachers, and he's getting religious ideas of a very particular kind. He's a good poet is what he is. But the ideas, most of the ideas are not original at all, and they come from groups that have preceded him. But of course, don't say that to any Muslims. You'll have your head sawed off and chucked into the wastebasket there. You know, they haven't gotten to the point where they can get to an intellectual criticism of their origins. That's beyond them at the moment because they're still in a medieval mindset world. They haven't separated church and state. And that's the battle that's going on in Europe today, and we're losing it. But I don't think it's because of the reason she's got on her computer. It's because we're dealing with a medieval mindset which is very difficult to work against when it's got unlimited oil resource money behind it. If it were not totally well financed and everything, then maybe you could do something. But with today's oil crisis mixed with that, we're in very serious trouble. And there's no way to placate it. There's no way to pacify it. There's no way to appease it. You can't appease it because it's the kind of mindset I'm telling you about from these other materials that preceded it. And the people who are working with it just don't understand what they're up against. Put it that way. I think you say, oh, Eisenman, you think you know everything. Well, yeah, I think I know this much. I know what we're up against. And I know how the mind works. I study it, and I know what's involved, and we just are not aware of what's involved. In any case, to go back to the groups and the scrolls and so on. The scrolls are an Essene sort of group that is very apocalyptic, believes in Daniel, sees Daniel as a prophet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't agree with the rabbis. You see, as Jews, we're on the rabbinical side because we've been taught that the rabbis represent the Judaism that we should pay our respects to because according to the presentation, they have perpetuated and allowed Judaism to survive for 2,000 years. Now, you say, well, okay, so the Pharisee party becomes the rabbinic party. Yes, the people who compiled the Talmud, the rabbis in the Talmud are all from the Pharisee party. You say, well, what about Christianity? How come they're anti-Pharisee? Well, because Christianity is anti-Pharisee because it's reflecting the original messianism of Palestine that was anti-Pharisee. The scrolls are anti-Pharisee. The scrolls are anti-compromise with foreign power. The scrolls are like this mindset that I'm telling you about in the Islamic world. No compromise, no way to appease them. That's why they all commit suicide. Josephus was supposed to commit suicide, but as a Pharisee, he didn't. He tricked the others and surrendered. And therefore lived to write these great histories. I'm glad he did in a way, although I think he's a horrible, rotten person. And I wouldn't want to even walk down the street with him tomorrow. If he appeared, I wouldn't talk to him. And I wouldn't touch him. I wouldn't have anything, I wouldn't have any commerce with such a person who watched other people die, was involved in other people dying. Sort of like the people who sent people off in the concentration camps to save themselves in the Second World War. I mean, okay, we're all under certain pressure, so we can't judge lest we be judged as it is, but you don't have to associate with certain kinds of individuals. And I think Josephus is, to me, a horrendous person, though I am grateful for his works. I mean, he represents everything that I personally despise in the world. Okay? And I put Paul in the same category, if you forgive me. These are people that to me represent everything that is abhorrent to me as someone who values the Jewish tradition, history, and so on. To me, the triumph of Pauline Christianity is the triumph of Hellenism. Triumph of Hellenism. The Jews fought 200 years against Hellenization, and Paul in one fell swoop produced it. You say, well, you mean, isn't that Jesus Paul is reflecting? I don't know. That's what we do in historical Jesus class. You're going to have to look into these things and decide for yourself. No, I don't think that is Jesus in any way, shape, or form. He wouldn't have been executed by the Romans if he was executed. And I think Paul, so one fact he seems to know that Jesus was executed by the Romans at some point. He doesn't know anything else about Jesus in his letters at all. And you would think he would know something, but he doesn't know anything. You think he would say, I was walking with Peter one day, and Peter told me that when Jesus was doing this, that, and the other thing, he did this, that, and the other thing, the way the rabbinic literature is. There's not a word like that in any. We have around 10 letters from Paul. He never gives any personal, and he lived almost in the same period as Jesus. I mean, he's flourishing in the mid-30s, Paul is. What, and he's never heard anything about Jesus? He doesn't have any stories to tell us about Jesus? He doesn't have any information to communicate about Jesus? No, of course not, because he never met him and he didn't know anything about him. He's involved with a supernatural being that he calls Christ Jesus. that he gets personal revelations from in his letters. Anyway, this is a total Hellenization of Judaism. So, of course, the Mosaic law goes by the boards, which is fine. I'm not an observer of Mosaic law myself, but I'm telling you how the Hellenization works. Jesus, as we know him, represents a triumph of Hellenization. I'm not against it. I love Greek temples. I love the Greek arts. I love Greek culture. But I have to say that the Palestinian people fought against what it represented. That is, the Jewish people in Palestine at that time. And they had 200 years, 250 years of resistance. Man, person, woman after woman after woman, man after man after man died in that struggle. From 175 BC to 70 AD, you add up, that's 250 years. That's the whole time this country's been in existence. We don't think of it as 250 years of struggle. And then some because of the Bar Kokhba uprising. So if you tack on to the Bar Kokhba uprising on that, 136, from 175, where are you? 136? 300 years. 300 years of struggle to the death against this. And then this is what happens. Okay, fair enough. I'm not, this was imposed by Roman armies. And the problem is that the Jerusalem center of these things was obliterated. And all that was left was the Pauline Gentile mission overseas. You say, well, didn't that represent the Jerusalem center? No, because in the letters of Paul you see quite clearly that they don't approve of what Paul's doing overseas. Not the rabbis. The leadership of his own movement don't approve of it. And he's very upset about that, and he gets very aggressive about that. I just read a passage in my class today. He says to the people who are coming around circumcising his Gentile communities because they believe that before you are heirs to the promise of the covenant, you must come in under the covenant. And the sign of the covenant is circumcision. So Paul, the whole letter to the Galatians is an attack on Jewish circumcision. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't be circumcised. I mean, you do whatever your religion says. But if you're going to rifle the Jewish cultural past and pick and choose out of its prophecies what you like and ignore the other ones, you're going to take things out of context and then use them as a prophetical thing for your particular religious persuasion, then I think you're to some extent dishonoring the tradition which you are well, as I say today, cherry picking. To use a intelligence which is being cherry picked. And I'm not a kosher person, and I don't follow the law, but I honor what those people who gave their lives did. And I wouldn't look, I just read in my class today what Paul says in Galatians. He says, I'll show you all these things in allegory. Abraham had 2 sons, Galatians 4. After attacking circumcision and Jewish festivals as beggarly elements and so on and so forth. He says, Abraham had 2 sons, had 2 sons. One was the daughter of the slave woman, one was the daughter of the free woman. The slave woman was Mount Sinai in Arabia. Her name was Hagar. That is the Jews today. Well, that's the exact opposite of the Jewish genealogical presentation. Now, you can get away with that in Ireland. If you're preaching in Switzerland, in the forest, nobody knows the history, that'll work fine. You couldn't do that in Palestine where people know the history. You couldn't say that to Jews in Palestine. Oh, well, you actually are the children of Hagar. I'm not against, I don't like, the Old Testament's very, very kind to Hagar. And I don't think Abraham treats Hagar well. And I think Sarah is a rotter in that situation, and so on and so forth. I'm not praising or not, if you've read the literature, any of the people involved. Hagar is a very sympathetic character, but she's presented as the father of the Arab peoples. She's not part of the Jewish genealogical presentation. So what does Paul? He just flips it over. He says, okay, the Jews are the children of the slave woman because they are enslaved by Mount Sinai in Arabia. So what's he doing? He's saying the Jews are slaves of Mosaic law. I mean, I don't have to be a genius to read through his allegories. And the people who, like the Islamic world, refuse to question anything and just take it as, oh, that's what he said, that must be right. I'm not of that mindset. I like to look at things and say, well, this is making sense. So in any case, so yeah, and that's the present day Jerusalem, which is enslaved. We, however, we new Christians, are the children of Sarah. Or he doesn't say Sarah. We are the children of the free woman. He doesn't want to say Sarah. He knows that isn't true. We are the children of the free woman. The children of the promise. Why? Oh, because we are free of the Mosaic law. Now you see, the way with freedom and slavery was being used then is that the zealot groups, the nationalist groups, were saying, we are enslaved to Rome, and we want freedom from Rome. On the Jewish revolutionary coins of that period, it says, Herut Israel, for the freedom of Israel. That's what the back of the revolutionary coin said. Or Geolat Israel, for the redemption of Israel. How many have seen Jewish revolutionary coins from that period? Well, they're in my books. You can see them. I got pictures of them in my books. And they're, they have great leaves, and they have these kind of slogans on them. It's also in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, freedom and slavery was freedom and slavery from Rome. No, not Paul. Freedom and slavery is freedom and slavery to the law of Moses. So at the end of Galatians, he then says, tell those who are troubling you, meaning the people who are demanding that you first convert and circumcise before you were heir to the promises, I wish they would themselves cut off. I wish they would their own gonies cut off, basically is what he's saying, because the Romans viewed circumcision as a kind of castration. And so that's what is going on beneath some of his letters. I'm just trying to say how this mindset got going. See, because this is Jewish messianism it's supposed to begin with. But I think Jewish messianism died in the first two uprisings in Palestine. Real native Palestinian messianism. Now, I hate to say that it went into Islam, but to some extent it did, and the Muslims wouldn't like to hear that. But the Pharisee party disassociated itself from all this. And it didn't want, that's why when you go to a synagogue today, what do you see? You see the American flag next to the pulpit. Why? Because the Pharisees, or the rabbinic descendants of the Pharisees, say, we honor whatever country we are in. This is going to be the debate of emancipation. Are we Frenchmen of the Hebrew persuasion, or are we Jews? What Herzl saw was that you couldn't be a Frenchman of the Jewish persuasion. You couldn't be a German of the Mosaic persuasion if you wanted. You couldn't be a Russian of the Mosaic persuasion in the mindset he was facing at that time, as illustrated by the Dreyfus trial. I think America's a different story. We all see that here. We're a mixture of races and peoples here. Okay, America, Herzl didn't know America, okay? Fortunately for us, or fortunately for America, I hope we come to a good end. Though, from what I'm seeing in the political strife in the country at the moment, I think the country is being tremendously weakened, and I don't know what the end result is going to be. But I hope that the country will be as strong as it can and should be in the face of tremendous threats, because nobody wants this country to flourish anymore. Europeans don't want it to flourish. They are extremely jealous of it, and I hate to put it that way. They don't recognize the tremendous gifts that this country gave it. They want to blame it for every little thing that's going on in the world. The Middle East don't want this country to flourish on the whole, and celebrate any backward step and so on. It's a very difficult time. I don't know about the Far East. I don't want to speak for that. But it is a very difficult time for the American people, and I don't know as they understand it. But anyway, Herzl and those people didn't know about America. There are a lot of people here in the world don't want America to flourish. That's all I can tell you. So the whole issue was, and Hitler, I think, settled that in Europe, unfortunately, and Russia continues on that, in that manner today. You can't live as a Jewish German or a Jewish Frenchman, is what Herzl saw in the Dreyfus trial. That we must have sovereignty. We must have a country. We must go back to the national dream, if you want to call it that. That's the only way we're going to survive. Well, as I said, his family didn't survive. Mendelssohn's family all converted, and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. So, well, why should they convert? That's great. Well, yes, if conversion were to something that wasn't a kind of self-hatred, if the thing you were converting to didn't have all the elements in it of the kind I just laid out for you to some extent, and I can lay out a lot more of it, yeah, it would be possibly an honorable thing to do if that's how you wanted to live. But I don't think it's an honorable thing to do in the circumstance of what's happened over the last 2,000 years, in the circumstance of what happened in Palestine in the wars that we just saw, and what happened to them under the Romans, and what happened in the last century in the Holocaust. In the face of that, I think it's a desertion, and it's dishonoring the people who did stick it. So, to me, those things are very, I'm just giving you my view, to say, because I'm saying, well, conversion, to my mind, is, fortunately for many of you, you don't have to face this problem. You're born in the tradition that you're in, and so you have to wrestle with your tradition in the way, in that way. But in the Jewish thing, the Jew is always faced with the thing about conversion. So you convert, to some extent you'll be left alone. At least that was the thinking. And it was true up until the 1940s, to some extent. And that's why Mendelssohn's people all went. And that's why people, as we'll see, this poet, Hermann Hesse, what's his name? He's the lyric poet of the German people. Heinrich Heine. Also, this other thinker we're going to meet, Moses Hess. All these people converted and then went back. Heinrich Heine went back. Karl Marx, all converted. Karl Marx's father converted him. Benjamin Disraeli, his father converted him so he could go ahead in the English society. That was the way of the 19th century until the 20th century. And then the people saw what was being felt underneath the surface, the threat of these conversions. I don't think it would happen in Europe today, because there's so many other minority groups in Europe now, they don't have time just to hate one group. But Europe was not a multi-ethnic society at that time. The only really minority ethnic group were the Jews, maybe gypsies. Now, it's a whole new world in Europe, and things might be a lot different. Okay, so let's go back then. So we're talking about the Pharisee party. The Pharisees represented the establishment the Romans put in power. The popular parties were the nationalist groups, as they always are, the resistance groups. It's the way it is in the Middle East today. It's the way it was in Palestine back then. The rabbinic presentation of the rabbis were the popular party. No, that isn't true. I was going to show you episode after episode after episode where the Maccabees are anti-Pharisaic. The Pharisees opposed the Maccabees. In fact, they get their birth moment from opposing the Maccabees and going over to a Seleucid Greco-Syrian king. It's in the Maccabee books. So why aren't the Maccabee books in the Old Testament of the Jews? Because the Pharisees disapproved of them. So you're a Jew, you're trying to celebrate Hanukkah, and all you know is the Festival of Lights, because that's all you hear about in the rabbinic literature, or dreidels, or potato latkes. But you don't hear about what the Maccabee struggle really was until these days, because it's not in the Jewish Bible. It's in the Christian Bible, which brings us to his question, the Septuagint. Okay, since you know about the Septuagint, what's the Septuagint?
The Greek translation of Tanakh. I was just asked the question because you said that the Pharisees put the Bible together in 100 AD.
Their version.
And I thought...
Yes, because the Septuagint, you see, had different books, different translations, and that's why in Christian Bible you have an Apocrypha.
Right.
Because the Septuagint and its descendants, the Vulgate Bible of the Roman Church, compiled by Jerome on the basis of the Septuagint and other documents. The Greek writers of the New Testament are using the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek version of the New Testament, and the theory behind it in some apocryphal works is that it was compiled around 200 BC or so, which is probably somewhat true. Septua means 72. Because the theory behind it was 72 Jewish elders, what it takes to make a Sanhedrin, were invited down to Egypt at the time of the Ptolemies. Who are the Ptolemies? How many saw Alexander the Great, the movie, which was the most worst movie that has ever been made in the last 15 years? In fact, people go to it as a cult movie now to laugh at it. It's so horrendous. But in any case, it did have some material in it. Who are the Ptolemies?
One of the four groups that took over after
Alexander died, right. There was one in Greek proper from his normal family. There was one in, I think, Asia Minor, one in Syria, one in Egypt. But anyway, they were the ones in Egypt. They were all generals of Alexander. And the one in Syria was another general called Seleucus. Those are the two main ones that we're interested in. You probably knows it to some extent from upper classes and from looking at the book of Daniel, which is very interested in the group in Egypt and the group in Syria. The reason Daniel is so pivotal is that, you see, for the Christians, Daniel is a prophet. And he's supposed to have written what he wrote in the 6th century BC, because where is Daniel mentioned in the Bible? I think he's mentioned in the book of Ezekiel. I think Ezekiel mentions a wise man called Daniel. But in that time, and someone asked me about apocryphal literature. Apocryphal and pseudepigraphic literature. Look, I'm sorry to waste all this time for you, but maybe you'll clarify how we got to our present situation, which is what I really want to do. And I'm going to try to skim through the other things. Apocryphal and pseudepigraphic. Apocryphal is extra books, additional books. Pseudepigraphic is works under a false pen name. Well, almost all the works we have are under a false pen name. Why would you put a work under a false pen name? Well, it's like getting advertisement, free advertisement. Who's ever heard of you? You're just Joe Schmo. If I can put it under Moses' name or Adam's name or Enoch's name, look at Enoch in the Old Testament. And Enoch walked with God. And he never came back. That's great. I have a vision. I saw I was up in heaven with God. When I was Enoch, I was walking around up there, and I write all my visions under Enoch's name. And that's what pseudepigraphic and apocryphal literature did at this time. So you also have Daniel, which is considered a pseudepigraphic book. There may be an original core, but it accretions onto it. And actually, scholars claim, and you'll have to decide what you think, but I could show you that the book was written in the 2nd century BC. It's actually the last book in the Bible, and it should be considered the last book in the Bible. It's a very recent book. It's written by what we call the Hasidic movement. It's written, the Hasidic movement is detailed for you in what books?
What was that?
The Hasidic movement. You know. The Maccabee books tell you about the Hasidic movement. Hasid in Hebrew means?
Righteous.
No, pious. Zadik is righteous. Hasid is pious. Hesed and Zedek, piety and righteousness. Loving God is piety. Hesed, loving your fellow man, is Zedek, righteousness. The Hesed-Zedek dichotomy. That's what ran through this whole period. Love God, and then Jesus speaks of it, the two love commandments. So, but Jesus in the New Testament goes further. He's portrayed as going further. I think the Hellenization occurs. You may think that's uniqueness. It may be. You'll have to decide that for yourself. To me, it isn't. I don't think that he said those things, judging by the behavior of some other people whom we know were descended from his movement or involved in the movement. That is, love your enemies. That was not part of the ethic in Palestine at that time. That's a Hellenistic idea. The Herodians actually said, one of the Herodian kings said, return good for evil. It's in Josephus' works because that's pouring coals on your opponent's head when you do that to him. It was a very Hellenistic sort of behavior pattern. Sort of like Neoplatonism, Socratic ethics. Socrates, remember, wouldn't flee. He wouldn't resist evil, and so on and so forth, which is not Palestinian, unfortunately. You say, well, yeah, but Jesus made it Palestinian. That's where the crux is. Does the non-resistance to evil, the turning the other cheek, loving your enemy, the love commandment as in advocating paying taxes to Rome, does that help the Pax Romanum or hinder it? To my mind, it's just what the Pax Romanum wants from conquered peoples, which is why the ethic is so successful in the Imperium Romanum. Now, I'm not saying it's not the right ethic. I'm not arguing the value or unvalue. I'm just arguing how Palestinian is this. You follow what I'm trying to say? Does it represent messianism in Palestine in the first century? You say, oh yeah, but that's the uniqueness. Ah, yeah, if I could believe that Paul knew Jesus, I might agree with you. But I know he didn't know Jesus, and that he's only substituting his own supernatural vision of Jesus for whatever Jesus may or may not have been on earth. And then the Gospels are written later on reinforcing that position. And I personally call the person in the Gospels, and just make it quick, Jesus Paul. Basically, it's Jesus Paul walking around. Jesus walking around Galilee is Paul walking around in Asia Minor and all these other places. And shaking the dust off his feet is what Paul does in Acts in the synagogues, and basically what Jesus is doing in Galilee and so on. It's called Galilee of the Nations, according to the way it is looked upon. And it's a long story. It's beyond our scope here. However, the messianism in Palestine, I don't know where we got off on that, but was a more, I know, we're getting into the Pax Romanum. Do these ideas help the Pax Romanum? Then I say the messianism in Palestine was a more resistance-minded, final apocalyptic war-minded thing. And I think Christians are torn between that. I'm not sure. There are onward Christian soldiers Christians. There are evangelical Christians. There are all kinds of Christians, and they themselves are torn on these issues. There are Christians who are more Zionist than most Jews. There are Christians who want to rebuild the third temple, and Jews don't even think about it. There's no rapture going to come without the temple being rebuilt, and so on and so forth. They're so Zionistic, it's hard for me well, I can't quarrel with them for sure, but it's hard for me to give you how Zionist they are. They were disappointed in the Lebanon war, for instance. They felt that the Israeli government copped out, sort of Phariseed out, if you want to call it that, of the recent war. I heard some of the evangelical ministers speak that way, and to my mind they were right. And I think this government is going to perish, this present government. I certainly hope with all my soul that it does. That's my own personal feeling. I think it's not representative of the Israeli people, and I don't think that, and I think it made a total mess of things, and I think it brought the Jewish people into disrepute by bombing huge neighborhoods of Beirut. That was unnecessary because they didn't want to take casualties and so on. It's a terrible decision. I'm not trying to second guess anybody, but I don't think that they performed nobly. And I think evangelical Christians felt that too, and were disappointed in their performance. And that's what I'm trying to say. There are evangelical, fundamentalist Christians who are totally of the opposite mindset of others. So there's all kinds of Christians, and there are all kinds of things wrestling in their souls, because the Jesus of Scripture is a split personality. On one sense, he says, I've come to bring fire and a sword. On the other side, he's president is saying, turn the other cheeks, render unto Caesar what is Caesar. It's a total contradictory elements going into the portrait there. So again, I don't want to waste your time with something you get in other classes, but the Scripture is a very difficult, layered problem. But going back to the situation of what messianism in Palestine was, I think it was this extreme messianism that we're talking about. And I think the Romans knew it as that, and they were frightened of it. And they would do anything they could to suppress it, and they fought it in Palestine twice. They destroyed the Jewish community in Egypt. People don't know that. They wiped it out in 115 in riots, and we found it in the Oxyrhynchus dumps. the records of the total eradication of the Jewish community in Egypt because of constant revolutionary activity. Jews in North Africa, Jews in Crete. This went on and on and on. And the Messianic movement was, according to the Roman literature of the period, was a disease that was spreading across the Mediterranean. They would do anything they could to exterminate it and wipe it out. I'm not blaming them or blaming the Jews. I'm just trying to give you an example. Okay, so once this happened, okay, so get back to the Septuagint, then we'll get on to the Pharisees and who survived. So once this happened, a book like the Septuagint has literature that is not in the Pharisee Bible. Now, when the Protestant Reformation occurred, they felt that they wanted to get away from the Catholic Church and the Catholic Bible. So they said, well, how can we rely on this Greek Bible, this Septuagint, this Vulgate, Latin is the Vulgate? We need to go to the Jewish original. We need to go to the rabbis and retranslate everything. So that's what Luther did, that's what Rockland did in Italy, and different people there, and finally the King James Bible in England. They went to the Jewish rabbinical text. They were getting a pretty good Bible, but they didn't know it was a Pharisee Bible. So you see, what is the difference between a Protestant Bible and a Catholic Bible? The Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are the extra books that are found in these Septuagint and other writings that are not found in the Jewish Bible. And the Protestants, having gone back to retranslate the Hebrew Bible in the 16, 17 centuries, left these books out, which is, I think they're not very good books. Most of them are inferior. But the weird thing is that the Maccabee books were in the Vulgate and the later Septuagint. Couldn't have been in the early Septuagint, 200 BC, because they weren't written yet. But in any case, they were in the later, what was called the Septuagint. And the Maccabee books tell you what Hanukkah is. How can you have the Maccabee books in a Catholic Bible who don't celebrate Hanukkah and not have it in a Jewish Bible who do celebrate Hanukkah? So that's the contradiction that occurred because of these political forces I'm telling you about. So the Catholics conserved a different Greco-Latin tradition, and the Protestants came along and said, we don't want that. We want to go back to the Hebrew one, but the Hebrew one was a late compilation. It doesn't mean it's inferior, it's just a later one of, I don't know, give you the dates. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are no books of the Bible there. They're just scrolls thrown in the caves helter-skelter. There's no way to understand which they considered holy and which they didn't consider holy. So everything was in flux. There's around, I don't know what the exact number is it 600 books we've never seen before? Something like that. I can't remember. There's 600 different books there right now, some in multiple copies, so that you have about 25 or 3,000 different manuscripts there. 2,100 or 3,000 different manuscripts there. But we don't know how holy some of the books were considered to be or how unholy, whether they were just writings or whether they were prophetic books. We have a temple scroll that's written in the name of God, which is written just like Deuteronomy is written, and so on and so forth. So there are books like that, like Enoch, and so on and so forth that are there, but they're not compiled in a Bible. The only books that seem to have been already recognized were the prophets and the Torah. They seem to have already been crystallized at the time of the scrolls, but all the rest in flux. So I can't tell you what were the holy books at the time of the scrolls. So, okay. The Pharisees then believed in getting along with secular power. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai got the academy. The academy and the discussions in the academy over the next 200 years and the tax collecting done by the patriarchs in Palestine for the benefit of the Roman overlords produced the situation that we call Judaism. Judaism is found in the discussions of the academies in Yavne and Babylon that occurred up to the 200s and then up to the 600s. Judaism, as we know, was forming just as Christianity was alongside it. The equivalent of the church fathers in Judaism are the academies of Yavne in Palestine and in several academies in Babylon where a lot of people went for refuge. And this wasn't finalized and put in any final structure until around the 600s. Now that is rabbinic Judaism. And it grew out of Phariseeism because all the other forms of Judaism had been banned by the Pharisees. Pharisees call them menim, sectarians. And they don't describe exactly what they mean. But clearly they mean apocalyptic, revolutionary, different groups like that. Obstreperous groups, groups that aren't willing to play ball. This is why the Holocaust occurred to some extent. Because I have to say, the groups that survived were willing to play ball. Play ball over, I'm putting it very quickly here, play ball over 1,800 years. You see, when you got a Warsaw Uprising, which groups led the Warsaw Uprising in Poland when they didn't want to go into the camps, when they refused to go to the camps, when they knew they were going to the death camp? Was it the rabbinical groups? No, of course not. Who fought in the sewers in Warsaw? The Zionist groups. The Zionist groups. That's who fought in the sewers in these places. All the others went peaceably, more or less, against overwhelming force. Why? Pharisaic Judaism. They're the perfect Christians, actually. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. If this is what Caesar demands, what can we do? We just go. And you say, I don't want to overdo it here, but this is one, you couldn't go to Scotland and do that. If you try to take people on trains away from Scotland and so on and throw babies into gas chambers, those people would go berserk. They would fight you to tooth and nail to the last man. They would not accept treatment like that. They would not accept it. That's why I don't understand why the Christians don't honor Jews. This is totally Christian behavior. This is turning the other cheek to the nth degree. No one gives them any credit because no one wants to even look at it. It's so horrible what happened. It's so horrendous what occurred. And they are so Christian in the terms of rendering under Caesar, turning the other cheek, and so on. Maybe they didn't love their enemies. That I don't think most Christian groups would behave like that. So, in any event, this is basically what happened when the Academy at Yavne produced the Judaism that we know. And this is why I feel the scrolls are so incendiary, because they show us another form of Judaism that didn't agree with Pharisee Judaism at all, but wasn't Christian as we know it. It's not Pauline. In fact, I think Paul is in the scrolls, and he's called a liar. I think they hate him. I think it's a form of anti-Pauline messianism that you have in the Dead Sea. That's my own personal view. It's very complicated stuff. However, and I think, by the way, the scroll people didn't come back to get the scrolls in the caves. Why? Because they all committed suicide on Masada. Those were the people that went to Masada and committed suicide. That's who they all were up there. And we found scroll documents up there, so that's pretty clear that that's where a lot of them went. Why didn't people come back after the war was over and get the documents in the caves? You know why no one came back to get the documents in the caves? Those are on parchment. You know what parchment is? Terribly valuable sheepskin. You could take it and write on the other side. Why didn't they come and get it? They couldn't. They were all dead or sold into slavery. No one came back. Not a single person came back. Why didn't they come back with a wheelbarrow? You mean your dad wouldn't go back with a wheelbarrow 20 years later and get some of those things and take them on home? If he could have, sure he would have. So would I. I'd have gone there. I'm not being lighthearted, but nobody survived. Everybody who knew about those documents either was taken away or killed. Everybody was killed. Period. And, so it's really a miracle for us to have. That's why I tried to do the struggle I'm involved. Okay, so that set the stage for medieval Europe. as the medieval kings descended from the Roman Empire, and I'll take that after the break, as the medieval kings descended from the Roman Empire, I think I've made it vivid enough now for you, they felt that the surrender to Rome of the Jewish people was a surrender to them. They saw themselves as heirs to the surrender of the Jews to the Roman Empire or the Roman emperors. And therefore, ultimately, the Jews were seen as the property of the crown. That's how the Jews were treated in the Middle Ages. That's what Rudowski covers, and I'll pick up there next time. That's what we're going to get to the emancipation. But the Jews were considered the property of the crown. That is the property of the Romans, and later on the Spanish kings, and later on Charlemagne, and later on the English kings, and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. That set the pattern for the way they were treated for the next 2,000 years. It's quite incredible to even consider that this could happen. But this is what happened, and that's why I wasted this time of yours. I apologize. Okay, I know I repeated myself. I won't go back on this unless you have a question. I think it's clear enough from my perspective what happened here, and I will go on to the next level. What?
I'm sorry, I know we want to go to break.
No, that's right.
Could you be a little bit more clear about the connection between the academic Pharisaic Judaism of...
How about after the break? How about after the break?
Great.
Get me that question after the break. Thanks for bearing with me, you guys. I apologize if I hurt any of your feelings. But it's something to think about, you know?